Montana Territory, November 1887. The cold came early that year, not the kind of cold that makes you pull your coat a little tighter. The kind that gets inside the walls, inside the wood, inside the spaces between your thoughts at 2 in the morning when the fire is dying and you are the only one awake, and you can hear from the room on the other side of the thin plank wall the sound of your youngest daughter coughing. Edna Marsh had been awake since just past midnight. She lay still for a while the way she always did, listening to the cabin settle and creak around her, listening to the wind find every gap in the chinking, listening to Ida's breathing go rough and ragged in the dark. She counted the seconds between each cough, told herself it was getting better, knew it wasn't. At 2:30, she got up. The floor hit her bare feet like a plank of ice. She moved fast to the hearth, crouched low, and fed 3 more logs into the coals. The fire caught slowly. The wood was dry enough, she had made sure of that, but the heat it threw barely reached the center of the room before the walls swallowed it whole. She held her hands close to the flames and watched her breath rise in small clouds above the orange glow. 53 degrees, maybe 54 if she was generous. She knew because she checked every morning with the small brass thermometer Thomas had ordered from a catalog 2 winters before he died. It hung on a nail beside the kitchen window, and every morning it told her the same thing. The fire burned all night. The wood disappeared, the temperature barely moved. She pulled on her boots and her heavy wool coat and stood in the middle of the room and listened to the cabin breathe around her, ice on the inside of the north wall. She could see it catching the firelight, a thin glaze along the logs where the chinking had failed again. She would repack it tomorrow. She had said that last week, the week before that. The clay mixture dried and cracked, and the cold found its way back through the same gaps within a fortnight, and she would pack them again, and the cold would return again, and so it went an argument she kept having with the same wall and losing by the same margin every time. From the back bedroom, Ida coughed twice, then again, then a long, wet sound that made Edna close her eyes. 9 years old, and that cough had been with her since October. A deep chest rattle that the older women in the valley recognized and said nothing about because there was nothing useful to say. Keep her warm, keep her dry, pray for an early spring. Edna was doing all 3, and it was not enough. She stood at the window and looked out at the dark. The barn was a black shape against a dark gray sky. No moon, nothing moving, just the wind and the cold and the distant sound of one of the cows shifting in her stall, a low and patient sound, the sound of an animal doing the uncomplicated work of simply being alive in the dark. She went back to bed at 3:15. She did not sleep. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about wood, how much she had left against the barn wall, how many weeks remained before March, which was the month the cold began, grudgingly and with no guarantees to ease. She did the arithmetic the way she did it every night, the same calculation, arriving at the same answer. The numbers did not improve with repetition. They simply confirmed what she already knew. She was burning more than she had. She was always burning more than she had. Thomas Marsh had come to Montana in 1875 with tools, a wagon, a team of horses, and the particular confidence of a man who has decided that one place has not given him what he was looking for, and another place might. He was not a foolish man. He was not reckless. He simply believed the way many men of his generation believed that effort was enough, that if you worked hard and long and without complaint, the land would eventually recognize the investment and begin to pay returns. For 9 years, it almost seemed like he was right. He found the valley through a man he met at a supply post in Billings, who described it with the evangelical enthusiasm of someone who had staked a claim there and needed it to be worth what he had paid. The valley was real enough. The creek was real. The grass was real. The winters the man in Billings had not described in full, which was a form of honesty by omission, that Thomas did not discover until his first November. He built the cabin with his own hands over the course of a summer, dug the root cellar in the fall, broke 2 acres of ground that first year, and coaxed something resembling a crop out of soil that had never been farmed by anyone who left records. He built the barn the second year. He filled it with 2 cows he bought on credit from a man named Fulton in the next valley over a transaction that felt optimistic at the time and proved over the following decade to have been correct. He had met Edna Briggs in the spring of 1869, when she was already a woman of middle years and considerable practical experience, a widow herself from a brief earlier marriage that had ended not in hardship but in illness, the quiet and ordinary kind that takes people without drama and leaves behind only the shape of the space they occupied. She came to the homestead with her own hands and her own quiet competence, and the settled quality of someone who had already learned the lessons that younger people are still in the process of learning, and together they made something that looked from the outside like it might last. Lavinia was already 15 in the fall of 1887. Ida was 9. Both girls had grown up with Montana winters the way children grow up with whatever conditions surround them from the beginning, which is to say they understood cold, the way they understood distance and silence, and the smell of snow coming before it arrived. But understanding cold and being adequately protected from it were different things, and Edna had never fully closed the gap between the two. Thomas died in October of 1884. Not from an accident, not from violence. From typhoid fever that arrived in late August after a summer of brutal work in the heat, a summer when he had pushed beyond what his body had stored up to give breaking new ground for an expanded wheat planting, digging a new irrigation channel from the creek, doing the work of 2 men because there was no second man available. He was sick for 6 weeks. He was not an old man when he died. He was not yet 50. Edna was 60 years old. She had 2 daughters, a homestead, and a Montana winter coming, and the nearest neighbor was 1.25 miles away across ground that a blizzard could make into a different world entirely. The neighbors helped that first winter. The way frontier communities help when someone loses a husband, which is with firewood and preserved food, and the quiet efficiency of people who understand that what they are doing today, they may need someone to do for them tomorrow. They came without ceremony and stacked wood and said little and left and came back again when the stack got low, and Edna accepted this the way it was offered, which was the acknowledgement that no person survived a Montana winter alone, and that the ledger of help given and help received ran long in both directions before anyone settled the account. She made it through the winter of 1884 to 1885 because of that help. The winter of 1885 to 1886 she managed on her own barely. She had cut through September and into October, stopping only when the ground froze and made the splitting work too costly an effort for what it returned. She had stacked carefully, covered the pile, done everything a person was supposed to do. By March, she was burning furniture. Not the good pieces. She was not sentimental about furniture beyond its function. But burning the kitchen bench that had stood against the east wall since Thomas built it felt like a renegotiation of the terms she had been operating under, a concession to the cold that she did not want to repeat. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was the winter that made her stop managing and start thinking. She did everything right. She started cutting wood in August. She stacked it under cover along the barn's south wall. She rechinked the cabin walls in September when the weather was still dry enough for the clay mixture to cure properly. She hung thick wool over the windows on the worst nights. She banked the fire every evening and woke to tend it 3 times before dawn. She did all of it, the full catalog of things a person was supposed to do, and it still was not enough. By February, her wood pile was down to less than a third of what she had started with. The cabin held maybe 50 degrees on a good night with the fire burning steadily. The bedrooms where heat never reached in sufficient quantity ran 10 degrees colder than that. The north bedroom where she slept with Ida was the worst. Ice formed on the nail heads in the walls on the coldest nights. She had started putting a folded blanket over Ida before she went to bed herself, tucking it around the child's shoulders without waking her, and Ida would throw it off in her sleep by midnight, and Edna would replace it, and 2 hours later, it would be on the floor again. Ida coughed through February, not the ordinary cough of a child in winter. The deep chest sound that older women in the valley recognized without commenting on because there was nothing useful to say about it. The sound meant the cold was inside the lungs, not just outside the body. It meant the child was fighting something, and the warm air she needed to fight it with was not available in sufficient quantity where she slept. Edna lay awake in the dark in the cold bedroom and did the arithmetic over and over, and arrived at the same answer every time. She was fighting a losing battle. The cabin was a box that took heat and bled it through every wall and every gap and every night-cold surface, and no amount of fire or wool or careful management was going to change that fundamental fact. She could work harder. She could cut more wood. She could wake more often and tend the fire more frequently. But she could not make the cabin into something it was not. She just did not know yet what else to do. The morning it all changed was in February of that year, 1887. She had been awake since before 4. The fire had burned low in the bedroom, and the bedroom was genuinely cold, not just uncomfortable cold, but the kind that makes you aware of your own body in an uncomfortable and newly specific way. She had added wood-made coffee, sat by the fire, until the room came up to something livable. Then she had pulled on her coat and her boots and her heavy work gloves and gone out to the barn to do the morning milking. Outside, the thermometer on the barn door read minus 22 Fahrenheit. She pulled the barn door open, stepped inside, and stopped. It was not warm. She was not going to call it warm. But it was something the cabin had not been in weeks. A quality of air that registered immediately before analysis, the way temperature registers when your body knows something before your mind has named it. She stood just inside the door and let herself feel it. The difference. Not dramatic, not the warmth of a room with a good fire going, but real. Somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees warmer than the air outside. And nothing in the barn was generating heat deliberately. No stove, no fire, nothing burning, just the animals. 2 milk cows in their stalls, breath rising in soft white clouds above their broad, patient heads. The mule in the far corner, ears at rest, one hind leg cocked in the posture of an animal that has made peace with its situation. A dozen hens roosting in the eaves above the stall partitions, puffed against the cold. Their eyes half closed, their feathers doing what feathers are designed to do. Their bodies, their warmth, the simple metabolic fact of their existence. She stood with her milk pail in her hand and looked at the dirt floor beneath her feet. Packed earth, not planking. Her feet were cold, yes, but not the bone-conducted cold of the cabin's wooden floor, which drew the warmth out of your souls the way a sponge draws water efficiently and without preference. The earth held something, not releasing cold the way the planks did, accepting her weight without giving back the chill in equal measure. She looked up. The heat rising from the animals was going somewhere. It was going up. It was concentrating near the roof, near the rafters, trapped there with nowhere to go but sideways into the boards. She stood with her milk pail in her hand and the cold at her back, in the modest warmth of 800 pounds of living animals in front of her, and she thought a thought so simple it almost embarrassed her. The animals sleep warmer than my children. She milked the cows slowly that morning. She stayed in the barn longer than the milking required. She walked the full perimeter of the space and put her hands on the walls and felt the difference between the exterior boards, which were cold through to the nail heads, and the interior air, which was not. She pressed her palm flat against the packed earth floor in several places. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about heat, where it went, what it did when it went there. Heat rises, that was the thing. That was the entire problem with the cabin, expressed in 2 words. Heat rose. It went to the ceiling and leaked through the roof boards and vanished into the night sky, and the hearth worked itself through cord after cord of wood, sending everything it made straight upward into the cold above, and no amount of additional burning closed the gap, because the gap was structural, not quantitative. You could not outrun a hole by pouring more water into a bucket that was already draining. But what if you were not above the heat? What if you were below it? She stood very still in the barn for a long time. The cows shifted. One of them turned her large brown head and regarded Edna with the mild and total patience of an animal that has nowhere to be and no opinion about when you intend to leave. A hen rearranged herself on her rafter perch with a small, indignant sound. Outside, the wind moved against the barn boards in a long, continuous pressure. Edna looked at the floor beneath her feet. 8 feet down, the frost never fully reached. She knew this from the root cellar, from the way the cellar held its temperature all summer, without any help cool in August and September, when the surface of the ground was dry and baked, because the earth at that depth operated on a different and more stable set of rules than the earth above it. Down there, the temperature held, not warm, but stable, insulated from the swings of the world above by the simple mass of everything between it and the surface. And on 3 sides, that same earth, wrapping around whatever you put into it, holding the heat you made instead of letting it escape into the sky. She stood there until the milk pail got heavy. Then she went back to the cabin and made breakfast and said nothing to anyone. But she was already measuring distances in her head. The northwest corner of the barn, away from the stalls. The depth to bedrock, which she estimated from the root cellar excavation at somewhere between 7 and 9 feet. The dimensions of a space that could hold 3 beds, a small table, a stove no bigger than the salvaged cast iron from the burned-out Hendricks claim sitting in her woodshed since the previous spring. She was already building it. Not with her hands yet, with the part of her mind that had been awake since midnight, looking at the same problem from every angle, and had finally found one that did not come back with the same wrong answer. 3 weeks later, in early March, she found Thomas's notebook. She had not been looking for it. She was going through the small cedar chest where he had kept his important papers, searching for the deed to the north pasture, which she needed for a boundary dispute with a neighbor that had been dragging on since the previous fall. She found the deed, and then beneath it, a leather-covered notebook she did not recognize. Not the ledger he kept for the homestead accounts. Something else, smaller, more personal. She sat down on the floor with it. Thomas's handwriting on the first page, tight and careful the way he wrote when he was thinking something through rather than recording something established. Most of the pages were numbers, calculations she could not fully follow, materials, lists, rough measurements with question marks beside several of the figures. But on the third page there was a sketch. It was rough, a cross-section view drawn in pencil showing what appeared to be a room built into the ground beneath a larger structure above it. The structure above was labeled in his careful hand barn. The room below showed walls, a floor, a small stove in one corner. There were arrows pointing upward through the barn floor labeled animal heat, arrows pointing inward from the surrounding earth labeled ground temp stable. At the bottom of the page in Thomas's hand, 2 words, worth investigating. Edna sat on the floor of the cabin and looked at that sketch for a long time. He had seen it. Before she had arrived at the same question, through the same morning in the same barn, he had looked at the same problem and started pulling on the same thread. He had sketched the idea and done preliminary calculations and written those 2 words, and then set the notebook in the cedar chest, and then he had gotten sick and the notebook had waited. She had not inherited the answer. She had inherited the question. She closed the notebook and held it in her lap and looked at the cold north wall with its glaze of interior ice. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek. Inside, Ida was sleeping, finally after a coughing fit that had lasted most of an hour, her small chest working more slowly now, the sound of her breathing rough but quieter. Worth investigating. Edna stood and placed the notebook on the shelf above the fireplace where she could see it. Then she went and looked at her remaining wood pile through the kitchen window and did the arithmetic one more time. March was here. The ground was still locked but loosening. She had maybe 3 weeks before the top 8 inches would give way to a spade. She began to plan. She started digging on the 9th of March. She chose the northwest corner of the barn, away from the stalls where the cows would be disturbed, close enough to the existing chimney structure that she could route stovepipe without attracting attention from the road. The barn floor above was sound built from 2-inch planking over solid joists, but she would need to work around the existing framework, which meant planning the ceiling before she planned anything else. She thought about it for 2 weeks before she put the spade in the ground. She thought about Thomas's sketch and about the limestone she had hauled from the creek bed to line sections of the root cellar, and how the root cellar held its temperature through the worst of summer without help from anyone. She thought about the salvaged cast iron stove in the woodshed, barely 2 feet square, built for a line cabin, too small to do anything meaningful in a full-size room, but potentially exactly right for a space the dimensions she was imagining. She thought about ventilation, about the family in Bozeman she had heard of who had sealed their home too tightly against one winter and been found by a neighbor the following morning. Carbon monoxide, colorless and odorless and patient. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about every way it could go wrong, and she thought about how to build against each of those ways one at a time until the list of objections had been answered. Then she got up at 4 in the morning and went to the barn. It was dark and cold and absolutely still. The cows heard her and shifted in their stalls. She set her lantern on an overturned bucket in the northwest corner and began. The first hour she moved perhaps half a cubic yard of earth. Her back stated its position on the matter clearly and without ambiguity. She kept moving. The cows watched her with their large and patient eyes. The mule in the far corner did not bother to look. By 5:30, the sky was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge, and she had a hole roughly 4 feet across and 2 feet deep. She spread the excavated earth across the floor of the far stall where it was indistinguishable from the existing ground. She put the spade away, fed the animals, and went back to the cabin and made breakfast before Lavinia and Ida woke. She did this every morning. She told no one. She asked no one's permission. She simply appeared in the dark with her lantern and her spade and her growing conviction that she was digging towards something that would work one bucket of Montana clay at a time. The work was not fast. The upper 2 feet came easily enough once the frost was fully out of the ground. Below that, the clay grew denser and the stones more frequent, requiring the iron bars she had found in the back of the tool shed to break through the packed sections before the spade could move them. Her back negotiated a permanent settlement with the work in which it agreed to participate in exchange for her agreement to acknowledge its objections each morning and then proceed anyway. 8 feet down, the spade rang against bedrock and she stopped. The excavation measured 10 feet by 12, larger than the back bedroom where she and Ida slept, large enough for 3 beds, a small table, the stove, and enough floor space to move around without turning sideways. She stood at the bottom of the hole on the morning she reached bedrock and held her lantern up and looked at what she had made. The walls were raw earth cut almost straight by the bar and the spade. The floor was bedrock, slightly uneven, but solid in a way that no human construction could replicate, solid in the way that things which have been solid for 10,000 years are solid without any particular interest in your opinion of their reliability. The limestone for the walls came from the creek bed a quarter-mile east. She hauled it in the wheelbarrow 2 or 3 blocks at a time in the early mornings. She split each block with a hand sledge and a chisel that had been Thomas's, working the stone the way she had watched stonemasons work when she was young, finding the grain and following it, persuading the rock rather than forcing it. The fitted walls went up slowly. Each course had to be level and true because a wall built crooked underground had nowhere to hide its error. The work consumed April and most of May. Her hands bled in the first 2 weeks, the skin splitting along the knuckle lines where the cold and the rough limestone took their toll. She wrapped them at night with strips of clean cloth and got up the next morning and went back to the barn. Her back was what her back was, and she had arrived at a working relationship with its limitations that involved neither resentment nor accommodation. Just the daily renegotiation of terms that she had been conducting with her body for 6 decades and expected to conduct for however many remained. The ceiling was the part she thought about most carefully. The barn floor above the excavation had to support the full weight of the animals, the hay stored in the loft, the equipment, and the seasonal load of snow that could sit on the roof for weeks at a stretch. She would not have it fail. She would not have it be the thing Silas Pratt had warned her it would be, the collapse, the slow settling of beams under load that she had not calculated correctly. She would not give it the opportunity. She used 8-inch timbers salvaged from an abandoned claim 5 miles to the north, carried one at a time in the wagon on 4 consecutive days, each one a full load for the horses, and a full morning of work to unload and carry to the excavation. She set them perpendicular to the barn's existing joists and notched each one into the stone walls at both ends so that the load transferred directly to the limestone and through the limestone to the bedrock beneath, not to the earth around it, which would move with the freeze and thaw of seasons. Between the beams, she laid split planks, tight-fitted, then packed 6 inches of clay over the top of them for insulation. The clay would transmit some cold. Not as much as open air. From inside the barn, you would never have known the space existed. The floor looked the same. The animals walked across it every day and gave no indication that anything had changed. The seams between the original planking and the new work were invisible at barn floor height. She cut the trap door in the northwest corner, close to the wall, hidden beneath a stack of feed sacks that she moved and replaced each morning, 3 feet by 3 feet. Hinged with hardware, she had taken off an old gate in the fence line east of the house, the heavy iron hinges that had been rusting there since she could remember. For the stove, she used the cast iron from the Hendricks claim, which she had retrieved from the woodshed and cleaned and set on the stone floor in the southeast corner of the underground room, as far from the sleeping area as the dimensions allowed. It was barely 2 feet square, built for a line cabin, the kind of stove a trapper would have used in a small backcountry shelter designed for spaces exactly like the one she was building. She ran the stovepipe horizontally through the east stone wall at the height of 8 inches above the floor level, then up the outside of the barn to join the existing chimney structure at a point where the junction was hidden by the barn's roof overhang. From the road, from any angle of ordinary observation, the barn appeared to vent normally. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would draw a second glance. The ventilation took 2 weeks of thinking and 2 days of building. She bore a 4-inch shaft straight up through the barn floor at the corner, diagonally opposite the stove, and disguised the opening with a section of hollow fence posts set vertically made to look like a structural support brace for the wall above. Fresh air entered through the draft at the base of the stove and got warmed before it circulated into the living space. Stale air rose through the stovepipe. She built 2 additional pathways, smaller, routed through the stone walls at different angles, because she had done the arithmetic on cross-ventilation, and she understood that if the primary shaft clogged in a hard freeze, which it might, and if the stovepipe drew back in a wind shift, which it could, she needed something else in reserve. 3 pathways total, different angles, different pressure dynamics. She tested each one by lighting a small fire in the stove and watching the smoke. By late May, the room was finished. She stood in it alone on the evening of the last day of work with a single oil lamp throwing warm light across the limestone walls. The room smelled of earth and stone, and the faint, warm animal smell that filtered down through the floor above from the coos and the mule and the hens going about their patient evening business. It was cool the way a cave is cool at its entrance before you go deeper, and it was absolutely dry. No moisture on the walls, no ice, no frost, no glaze on the nail heads or the hinge hardware. She lit the small stove with 5 logs, closed the trap door above her, and sat on the floor. She waited. In 40 minutes, the room reached 60 degrees Fahrenheit. She sat in that warmth in the quiet underground while the Montana evening settled into night above her, and she did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated or proved right, or any of the things a person feels when they have been doubted and have been shown to be correct. She felt something quieter than that, something that lived below triumph the way the room lived below the barn, something more like relief of a depth that is only possible after fear of an equivalent duration. The relief of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally found a place to set it down and is not yet sure whether to believe the weight is really gone. She let the stove burn for an hour. Then she climbed the ladder, replaced the feed sacks over the trapdoor, and went back to the cabin. She told no one, not yet, not until November, when the test would be real. Lavinia found out in late April. Not because Edna told her, but because Lavinia was 15 years old and sharp-eyed and had been watching her mother disappear into the barn before dawn every morning for 6 weeks, and Lavinia was not the kind of girl who observes something unexplained for 6 weeks without investigating. It was a Thursday morning close to 5 o'clock, still full dark. Edna had been underground for an hour fitting the last course of limestone along the south wall when she heard the trap door lift above her. She looked up with her lantern raised and saw Lavinia's face looking down from the opening. The girl's expression was not what Edna had expected. In the fraction of a second, she had to form an expectation before seeing it. It was not curiosity. It was not the expression of a child who has discovered something surprising and is amused by it. Lavinia's face was the face of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has just found the source of the fear and the relief of knowing what the thing is, warring with the anger at having been kept from knowing. "What are you doing?" Lavinia said, not a question. "Come down," Edna said. "It's a hole." "It is more than that now. Come down." Lavinia climbed down the ladder. She stood with her arms crossed and turned slowly in the space, looking at the limestone walls, the fitted ceiling planks, the stove in the corner with its pipe running through the wall. She turned slowly and took it all in with the methodical attention of someone who is going to have opinions and is gathering the information she needs to form them correctly. Edna pointed upward toward the barn floor above them. "Where does heat go?" she said. Lavinia looked at the ceiling. "Up," she said after a moment. "Up. It goes up into the barn and up into the rafters, and it sits there doing nothing while we freeze below it. I am building us a place to sleep where the heat goes." Lavinia was quiet. She put her hand flat against the stone wall and held it there, feeling the solidity, the dry coolness of the limestone. "You should have told me," she said finally. "I am telling you now." Another silence. Lavinia looked at the stove, then at the ceiling, then at her mother. "How much more is there to do?" "Weeks," Edna said. "The ventilation, some finish work on the south wall." Lavinia looked at her mother for a moment with an expression that Edna could not entirely read, something between assessment and a feeling she recognized but did not name aloud. Then Lavinia reached past her and took the second spade leaning against the wall, the one Edna had not been using because one pair of hands could only work so fast. "Show me where," she said. From that morning forward, they worked together. They developed a system without discussing it, the way people develop systems when they have lived in close enough quarters long enough that discussion has become mostly redundant. Lavinia worked the stone. Edna worked the wood in the stovepipe. They communicated in the compressed language of shared space and shared purpose. A look, a gesture, the sound of a tool set down that meant finished here, come and look. They finished the ventilation shaft in 3 days. The stovepipe fitting in a long Saturday when Ida was at the Connell property for a neighbor girl's birthday. And then because children talk and because Lavinia was 15 and had a friend named Sarah Connell, whose mother Margaret had a gift for distributing information efficiently through a small community the valley knew. The reactions arrived in the order such things always arrive. Confusion first, then concern, which was real. Then the particular kind of social pressure that arrives dressed as concern, but is operating from a different motive, which is the discomfort of people who have invested in a particular understanding of how things should be done and find that investment challenged by someone who is doing them differently. Margaret Hollis was 67 years old and had come to the valley from Pennsylvania with her husband Edmund, who ran the only lumber supply operation for 30 miles. She was not a cruel woman. She was not malicious. She was a woman with strong opinions about the proper way to conduct a household, and she considered the sharing of those opinions a form of civic contribution, rather than interference, which is a distinction that looks clearer from the inside than it does from the outside. She heard about the room from Edmund, who heard it from the man at the feed store, who heard it from Sarah Connell's mother, who had it from Lavinia Marsh directly. She did not come to see it. She processed the information through the available social channels. Sleeping beneath animals, she said, in the way that people in small communities make their important announcements, which is to no one particular and therefore to everyone present. She has given up trying to maintain a proper household. That is what happens when a woman is left alone too long without the civilizing influence of a functioning domestic arrangement. The murmurs she received in response were not the murmurs of people who agreed in their bones. They were the murmurs of people who had not yet formed an opinion and found it easier to murmur agreement than to examine the question. The valley was not a cruel community. It was a community operating under the standard human preference for the familiar, which made the unfamiliar into the suspicious by default. Pastor Nolan came by the homestead on a Tuesday morning in late spring. He was 64 years old, a decent man from Ohio who had arrived in the valley 3 years earlier with solid convictions and a genuine pastoral concern for the families in his community. He had not yet experienced the kind of Montana winter that reorganizes a person's understanding of what matters. He stood at the barn door and said he had heard about the room and wanted to make sure the girls were managing well. Edna looked at him for a moment. "Would you like to see it?" she said. He hesitated. He said that would not be necessary. He said he simply wanted to make sure the family was not struggling. "We are not struggling," Edna said. He nodded. He stood for a moment as if he expected something more and did not receive it. Then he left. Silas Pratt was different from the others. Pratt was 68 years old and had been doing carpentry and construction work in the territory for 30 years. He had built barns and cabins and commercial structures across 3 counties. He was not a man who made quick judgments, but he was also not a man who was easily moved by unconventional approaches from people who lacked formal training. He had seen confident people build badly too many times to approach the unfamiliar with anything other than measured caution. He was passing through the valley on his way north in late June and stopped at Edna's property because he had heard about the room and wanted to see it. This was straightforward, and he said so. Edna showed him. Pratt stood at the bottom of the ladder in the underground room and turned slowly. He looked at the ceiling beams. He looked at the stovepipe running through the wall. He looked at the ventilation shaft. He looked at the limestone. He looked at all of it with the professional eye of someone who has seen a great many things built and has opinions about whether they were built correctly. He was in the room for perhaps 30 seconds. When he turned to look at Edna, his expression was not contemptuous. It was genuinely concerned in the way that an experienced person is genuinely concerned when they see someone they believe is about to make a serious mistake. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I have seen men with engineering training attempt things like this. It does not usually end well. That ventilation shaft clogs in a hard freeze, and you will fill this space with carbon monoxide before anyone above knows there is a problem. Those beams settle wrong under load, and the barn floor shifts. I have seen both happen. Edna looked at him. The beams are notched into the limestone walls, she said. The limestone is set on bedrock. The load path goes to rock, not to earth. There is no frost movement in the load-bearing members. She paused. And the ventilation has three independent pathways at three different angles. If any one of them clogs, the other two maintain airflow on differential pressure. There is not one pathway. There are three. Pratt absorbed this. He looked at the ceiling again, at the wall where the stovepipe ran through. He nodded the way a man nods when he has heard something that requires him to reconsider, but is not yet prepared to do so fully. I hope you are right, he said, for your girl's sake. He climbed back up the ladder. Edna followed him to the barn door and watched him cross the yard toward his horse. She did not call after him. She did not argue. She had explained the engineering because the engineering was correct and relevant and deserved to be stated. She did not need him to believe her. She did not need any of them to believe her. She needed the room to hold its temperature through January and February, and no amount of community opinion was going to affect that outcome one way or the other. She went back to the barn and checked the stovepipe fittings one more time. Then she checked the ventilation shaft. Then she went to the cabin and made dinner. November was coming. The wood she had saved over the summer was stacked along the barn's south wall 4 feet high and covered with canvas weighted at the edges against the wind. Half of what the neighbors had. A fraction of what they would burn before spring if they continued fighting the cold the way they had been fighting it, which was to say by throwing fuel at a structural problem and hoping the fuel was sufficient. She stood in the yard in the last of the October evening light and looked at the wood pile and did the arithmetic she had been doing since February, and this time the arithmetic came back different. Not because the numbers were different, because the question had changed. She was no longer calculating how much wood she needed to survive the winter. She was calculating how little. She went inside to where Ida was coughing again, soft and tired in the back bedroom, and she thought about the room below the barn with its stone walls and its dry, stable air, and the warm, living weight of the animals above it, and she allowed herself something she had not permitted in 3 years of managing alone, the smallest possible hope. Not that she had been right. She would know that in January. What she allowed herself was simpler than that. Just the hope that the winter would show her one way or the other what was true. And if it showed her what she thought it would, then the thermometer would say what needed to be said far more effectively than any argument she could make in any conversation in any settlement store in the valley. The thermometer always told the truth. It was the only witness she had ever fully trusted. Montana Territory, November 1887. The first night they slept underground, no one said anything. Edna had moved the beds down in the first week of November, when the first real freeze of the season had set the ground and the temperature on the barn door thermometer was reading single digits by midnight. The frames came apart and went through the trap door in pieces and went back together by lantern light below. Lavinia's bed against the east wall, Ida's smaller frame against the south stone perpendicular to the stove, Edna's own against the north wall close enough to the ladder that she could reach it quickly. It took most of a Saturday. When it was done, the three of them stood in the finished room and looked at what they had made. The oil lamp threw warm amber light across the limestone walls, and the walls threw it back. The stove sat cold in the corner waiting. The ceiling was low enough that Edna could touch the underside of the barn planks if she stood on her toes, and through those planks, faint and warm and entirely reliable, came the sound and smell and metabolic presence of the animals above. Ida walked to the south wall and put her palm flat against the stone the way children test things with the full flatness of the hand rather than the careful fingertips of an adult. "It's not cold," she said, not a statement of approval or disapproval. Pure factual surprise. "No," Edna said. Ida looked at the ceiling, at the trap door and the ladder, at the small window set at ground level through the east wall, currently showing nothing but the dark underside of the snow that had settled against the barn's foundation. "Are we moles now?" she said. "We are people who understand where the heat goes," Edna said. Ida considered this with the seriousness that she brought to most things, which was the seriousness of a child who had learned that her mother's explanations generally contained more than their surface suggested. Edna lit the stove with 6 logs and closed the trap door above them. In 50 minutes, the room had reached 58 degrees. By the time the girls were asleep, the stone walls had absorbed what the fire had given and begun the slow return of it, and the room held 60 degrees without the stove being touched. Edna sat in the warmth and listened to the sounds of the barn above her. The shift and breath of the keys, the occasional movement of the mule, the small private sounds of 12 hens settling deeper into their roost. She added 2 logs at midnight, 2 more before dawn. At 6:30, she woke to a room that read 54 degrees on the brass thermometer. She lay still for a moment, no coughing. She turned her head. Ida was asleep, both hands tucked under her chin, 2 blankets over her, instead of the 5 she had needed in the upstairs bedroom. Her chest rose and fell in the slow, untroubled rhythm of a child genuinely asleep. Her breathing was clear, not the sound of a child whose lungs are fighting something in the cold hours before dawn, just breathing. Edna got up and put 2 logs on the coals and climbed the ladder to do the morning chores. The barn was 36 degrees. The air outside was 4. She stood at the barn door for a moment and looked across the yard at the cabin. Dark and cold, the window glass showing frost on its interior surface from 20 feet away. The building she had spent 3 winters losing ground in 1 armload of wood at a time, 1 sleepless, cold hour at a time. She went and milked the cows. She said nothing to anyone. But something in her had shifted that night, something that had been held in provisional tension since February and had now resolved itself into a quieter and more stable form. Not pride, not the satisfaction of being proven right, just the certainty that comes from results that do not require your interpretation. The room was 54 degrees at 6:30 in the morning, after a night when the outside temperature had reached 4 above zero. Ida had slept without coughing. The stove had consumed 8 logs total. The facts did not need her to advocate for them. They had already spoken. The weeks that followed had a quality Edna had not experienced in 3 years. Not ease exactly. The homestead still demanded what it always demanded, which was everything she had, and then a negotiation about what remained. The animals needed tending. The wood needed splitting. The food stores needed managing with the careful arithmetic of someone who could not afford to get the subtraction wrong. None of that changed, but underground at night, something was different. The room held its temperature with a consistency that the cabin upstairs had never approached. The stone walls absorbed the heat during the active burn hours and returned it through the night, doing their patient thermodynamic work without any attention from her. The animals above contributed what they contributed, 3,000 to 4,000 BTUs of passive warmth, filtering down through the barn floor every night by the simple biological fact of their continued existence, and the earth on 3 sides held its stable mid-40s, insulating the space against the swings of the world above. 6 logs in the evening, 2 at midnight, 2 before dawn, 10 logs a day to maintain 55 to 60 degrees in a Montana winter. She had been burning 30. Ida's cough did not disappear in a single night. It wound down over the course of 2 weeks, the morning attacks growing shorter, the deep chest rattle growing quieter, the intervals between coughs growing longer. Until one morning, Edna realized she had not heard it and looked at the thermometer and saw 56 degrees and understood that the 2 facts were connected in the most direct possible way. The cold had been in the child's lungs for hours every night, 8 hours of cold air every night all winter long. The lungs could not heal what kept being damaged. Lavinia noticed before anyone said anything about it. She came to stand beside Edna at the stove one evening in late November, while Ida was doing her schoolwork at the small table, head bent over the page pencil working. Lavinia stood close and said quietly, not looking at her mother, looking at Ida, "She is better." "Yes," Edna said, a long moment. "Because of this." "Because her lungs are warm at night," Edna said. 8 hours of warm air every night. Her body can do what it was trying to do. Lavinia watched her sister for another moment. Then, "Why does no one else do this?" Edna looked at the walls, at the low ceiling, at the small stove working in its corner with no more drama than a lamp works in its bracket. "They will," she said, "when they have a reason to." The social pressure arrived in its second wave in the 3rd week of November, organized this time rather than ambient. Margaret Hollis, having established a community consensus that Edna Marsh's living arrangement was both unorthodox and potentially concerning, had apparently escalated the matter to the level of pastoral intervention. The word Edna, received through the oblique channels by which small communities communicate such things, was that several families had expressed concern about the welfare of the Marsh girls. Pastor Nolan came back on a Tuesday. This time he came to the barn where Edna was working. He was dressed for cold, and he carried the expression of a man who has been asked to do something he finds slightly uncomfortable and has decided to do it properly anyway. He said he was there on behalf of the community's concern for her family's well-being, that he wanted to make sure the children were properly housed and cared for. Edna set down the pitchfork she had been using. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come with me." She led him to the northwest corner. She moved the feed sacks. She lifted the trap door. The warm air rose immediately, the difference between the barn's 38 degrees and the room's 57 degrees rising in a column that he could feel before he had taken a single step toward the opening. "Come down," she said. He looked at the ladder, at the opening. He hesitated. Then he climbed down. Edna followed and set 2 fresh logs on the stove, not because the room needed them, but because she was in the habit of keeping the fire from going too low. The room was 57 degrees. Outside, the thermometer on the barn door had read 11 that morning. She did not mention this. She went to the small shelf along the east wall and put the kettle on the flat top of the stove. Pastor Nolan stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. He looked at Lavinia's books, stacked on their shelf. At the small drawing Ida had made in charcoal, pinned to the wooden post beside her bed, a picture of the 2 cows as seen from below their large, gentle faces looking down through the boards, with a bovine benevolence that was both accurate and charming. At the 2 blankets on each mattress, not the 5 they had required upstairs. At the brass thermometer on its nail. He was quiet for a long time. The kettle began to push steam from its spout. Edna poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one and sat down on the bench. She did not explain or justify or advocate. She just sat in a room that was 57 degrees, while outside the morning sat at 11, and she let the temperature do the explaining. He stayed for 20 minutes. When he climbed back up the ladder and she followed him to the barn door, he stood for a moment in the cold air and said carefully, "The children appear to be well." "They are," Edna said. He nodded. He started to say something further and then reconsidered it. He left. He did not return with any additional concern for her family's well-being. Edna watched him cross the yard toward the road. Then she went back underground and finished her tea. The storm announced itself 3 days before it came. January 8th, 1888. The sky in the northwest developed in the late afternoon a particular quality of color that Edna had learned over 6 Montana winters to read correctly. Not the ordinary iron gray of a working winter sky. Something flatter, more final. The kind of sky that has made a decision and is not interested in your response to it. The temperature had been dropping since noon. By 4 in the afternoon, it was -12. By sundown, it had passed -18 and was still dropping. She spent the 9th and 10th preparing. Extra hay in the barn, double the ordinary ration, enough to keep the animals generating maximum body heat for 4 days without any trip to the outside stack. The root cellar restocked with what she might need if going between buildings became impossible. The water barrel filled to the brim, every stovepipe fitting in the underground room checked. Every ventilation pathway cleared and tested. The trapdoor hinges oiled. She brought an additional cord of wood down through the trapdoor on the afternoon of the 10th and stacked it against the east wall below the limestone. Enough for 5 days of steady burning if she was careless. Enough for 7 if she was not. She estimated she would need perhaps a third of it. The night of January 10th, she lay in the underground room and listened to the wind beginning to build against the barn boards above her, a low and purposeful sound that was different from ordinary winter wind, the way a river running hard is different from a river running normally. She listened to it and felt the stone walls around her and thought about Thomas's notebook on its shelf above the fireplace in the empty cabin. Worth investigating. She had investigated. She knew what the answer was. She slept. The blizzard struck at 4 in the morning on January 11th, 1888. Not gradually, not with warning. It arrived the way serious Montana storms arrive, which is fully committed and without apology, as if everything that had been building in the northwest sky for 3 days had finally decided that patience was no longer required. The temperature dropped to -31 Fahrenheit before dawn and kept going. The wind drove to 45 miles per hour and gusted higher, and the gusts were the kind that make structures speak the high-load groan of timber under real pressure. Not the ordinary complaint of buildings being pushed, but the deeper sound of buildings being tested. The snow came horizontal, so dense that within 2 hours of the storm's arrival, the cabin was invisible from the barn door. The valley disappeared. The road became a theoretical concept. The world contracted to whatever you could see through whatever window you were standing at, which was white, and whatever you could hear, which was the storm continuous and enormous, dismantling the familiar geography of the world above. Edna heard it from underground. A muffled roar filtered through 8 feet of earth and 2 feet of limestone, and the warm mass of the animals on the floor above her. Present, real, unmistakable in its scale, but not immediate, the way distant thunder sounds from inside a root cellar. Real but separated from you by something solid and reliable. She got up at 5 and fed the stove 6 logs. The room was 55 degrees. She made coffee on the stovetop and drank it sitting at the small table in the lamplight while the storm worked against the world above her with everything it had. She climbed the ladder partway and checked the animals through the gap in the trapdoor. All present. The cows were standing. The mule was in his usual corner. The hens were roosted and puffed and contributing their small but real metabolic warmth to the barn floor above her daughters. She went back down and closed the trapdoor. She sat and thought about the families across the valley. Earl Moss was a mile to the east with his wife and their grandson Caleb, 8 years old, staying with them for the winter, while his parents worked a claim further north. Earl was 71 years old and had survived 32 Montana winters, which meant he knew what this storm was the moment it hit his walls, the same way a person recognizes something they have seen before in its most serious form. He knew what it was, and he prepared accordingly, and it was not enough. The chimney began backdrafting by mid-morning when the wind shifted to come hard from the north. The draw that normally pulled smoke upward reversed direction and sent it into the cabin in slow, eye-watering waves. Earl had to choose between a dying fire and a cracked window, and he chose the window, and the temperature dropped 4 degrees in 20 minutes, and he closed the window and the smoke returned. He spent the rest of the morning managing the arithmetic of suffocation versus freezing, neither term of which was acceptable, both of which were on offer. By afternoon, with the fire at minimum, and one window cracked a 1/4 inch, and the cold coming through that 1/4 inch with the focused efficiency of cold, in a confined channel, the cabin had fallen to 38 degrees. Caleb sat wrapped in everything available, his hands around a cup of warmed broth, his color not what it should have been. Earl stood at the window and looked at the white nothing where his yard had been, and thought about his woodpile, what he had started with, and what he had already used in 11 months, and what was left, and the arithmetic told him something he did not want to hear. At the Hollis property, a half-mile south, Margaret was burning furniture by the end of the first day. Not from desperation, not yet. From calculation, which was worse in a way, because it meant she had assessed the situation and made a judgment about what was required, and the judgment was furniture. The cabin was 38 degrees and falling. Edmund had looked at the dining chairs and looked at his wife, and she had nodded, and he had carried them to the stove one at a time. Margaret sat in her heaviest wool in the main room and watched the chairs burn and did not permit herself to think about what she had said about Edna Marsh in the summer because the situation was urgent and the past was not useful to her at the moment. But the thought came anyway, the way thoughts come when the temperature in your house is falling and you are burning your furniture and the storm is only in its first day. She thought about the underground room. She had been dismissing the thought for an hour before she acknowledged she was having it. She circled it the way water circles before committing to the drain. The mind protects itself from certain admissions by approaching them from the side, and Margaret Hollis's mind was very good at this kind of protection. It had kept her in very good standing with herself for 67 years through some reasonably challenging circumstances. But she had heard the number, 58 degrees, 14 hours after the fire had gone out. She had heard it from Eliza Connell, who had it from Earl Moss, who had it from someone who had been down in the room and seen it on the thermometer. 58 degrees with no active fire in January in Montana. She looked at Edmund feeding the second chair into the stove. She looked at the window, which showed nothing but white. She thought about the night that was still coming. Silas Pratt had been caught away from his own property when the storm hit. He had been at a homestead 10 miles to the south and doing repair work on a collapsed porch had stayed for supper when the afternoon sky began its preparations and had waited too long to leave, and then decided correctly that leaving was no longer a viable option. He had made himself useful through the first day, which was his nature. By the second night, the chimney on the property began to crack from thermal stress. The differential expansion of warm stone interior against frozen stone exterior reaching the breaking point. He spent 18 hours on a cold repair that held well enough for a small fire but would not survive another hard freeze without proper work. He sat in a cold house at 30 degrees and thought about the underground room he had inspected for 30 seconds in June and dismissed in 2 sentences, and had not thought about again until the first morning of the blizzard when the thermometer in the cabin where he was sheltering had read 34 degrees and he had started doing arithmetic about what 58 degrees would feel like right now. Across the valley, the same story repeated itself in its local variations. Families burning everything they had, shivering despite roaring fires, counting hours until the storm broke, discovering that every solution they had trusted was insufficient to the problem actually being presented. Below the barn floor on the Marsh homestead, Edna's routine on the first full day of the blizzard looked like this: 6 logs on the stove at 5 in the morning, 2 more at noon, 2 at evening, 10 logs for the day. The room held 57 degrees in the afternoon with the fire going, and 53 by early morning before the next loading. The wind could not reach her. The earth could not be moved by wind. The stone walls did their patient, absorptive work. The animals above contributed their 3,000 to 4,000 BTUs through the barn floor, and the contribution went into the calculation on the positive side, as it had every night since November, as it would continue to do for as long as the animals were alive and warm. Ida did her schoolwork by lamp in the afternoon, lying on her stomach on her bed with her pencil, and her reader, her feet in wool socks, 2 blankets, the room at 57 degrees. She did not cough. Not once in 3 days of storm, in 58 to 57 degrees of stable warmth in air that had been heated before it reached her, and that the stone walls held at a temperature her lungs could manage without effort, did Ida Marsh cough. The second night of the storm was worse than the first. Temperature fell to -34 Fahrenheit by midnight. The wind increased. The weight of accumulated snow on every roof in the valley pressed down on the timber structures above it, with the indifferent patience of physics being physics. Edna had added 4 logs at 11, checked the animals at midnight, was back in the room and in her bed by 12:30. She was nearly asleep when she heard it. Not the storm. The storm had become a constant, a background presence like running water that the mind eventually incorporates rather than registering as event. What she heard was different, closer, transmitted down through the barn floor and the 8 feet of earth between her and the outside world. A knock. She was up the ladder in 30 seconds. She lifted the bar on the barn door and pulled it open against the wind's full resistance, and the cold came in like a physical wall, -34, and moving, and Margaret Hollis was standing in the barn doorway. She was wearing everything. 2 coats, one over the other. Her heaviest wool scarf wound around her head and face until only her eyes were visible above the folds. Snow packed into every surface and fold of her clothing. She had walked half a mile through a blizzard at midnight in -34 degrees, through chest-high drifts in the stretches where the wind had moved them, and she was standing upright and her eyes were steady. Not the steadiness of composure, the steadiness of someone who has used up all the composure and arrived at something simpler and more honest on the other side of it. She said, her voice muffled through the wool, "We have enough wood until morning. I do not know about after morning." Edna looked at her, at the snow packed into every surface of her clothing, at the half-mile of blizzard she had crossed to stand in this doorway. She thought about everything Margaret Hollis had said about her in the summer, about living beneath animals, about giving up trying to be civilized, about what happens to a woman who is left alone too long. She thought about Edmund feeding the dining chairs into the stove one at a time. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Come down." She led Margaret across the barn floor to the northwest corner, moved the feed sacks, and lifted the trap door. The warm air rose immediately 57 degrees, meeting the 38 of the barn, in a column that was physically perceptible, and she heard Margaret make a small, involuntary sound behind her, and not a word, just the sound a person makes when something they needed very badly turns out to be real rather than imagined. They descended the ladder together. Edna put 2 logs on the fire and gestured at the bench. Margaret sat down and began unwinding the scarf from her face with fingers that were stiff and slow from the cold. Her face, when it appeared, was stripped of the layer of social certainty that usually occupied its surface, the layer that had formulated and delivered pronouncements about what was dignified and what was not for 67 years with considerable fluency. What was underneath was older and more honest. She did not say anything for a while. She sat in 57 degrees in the lamplight and let herself be warm, and Edna sat across from her and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said that the thermometer had not already said with greater precision than either of them could manage. The storm pressed against the world above them and found nothing that mattered to press against. The stone walls held. The earth held. The animals shifted in their stalls and breathed and generated their patient, reliable heat and let it filter down through the barn floor to add its portion to the calculation. Finally, Margaret said quietly, looking at the stove rather than at Edna, "I told people this was beneath dignity." "I know," Edna said. A long silence. "I was wrong," Margaret said. Edna did not respond to this directly. She got up and poured 2 cups of water from the pot on the flat top of the stove, which was always kept warm, but not boiling, a habit she had developed in the underground room, because warm water cost nothing extra when the stove was running. She handed 1 cup across. Margaret took it. They sat in silence for another hour while the blizzard ran its course above them, and Lavinia and Ida slept undisturbed in their beds with 2 blankets each, and the thermometer held at 56 degrees, and the stone walls did the quiet work they had been built to do. The storm ran for 3 full days. 72 hours of -30 and wind that did not pause to reconsider. When the wind finally began to drop on the morning of January 14th, it dropped the way large things drop gradually over the course of 2 hours, the roar diminishing to a moan, and the moan to a pressure, and the pressure to the ordinary sound of winter settling back into its baseline after an interval of maximum expression. By 9 in the morning, the valley had gone quiet under 4 feet of new snow and a pale, cold, perfectly clear sky. Edna climbed the ladder and unbarred the barn door and looked out at what the storm had left. The drifts were chest high against the north side of every structure. The cabin was half buried. The road between properties had ceased to exist as a road and had become simply another surface of white, distinguishable from the fields only by the fence posts that protruded from it at irregular intervals. The sky above was the particular cold blue of a January morning, after a serious storm, cloudless and bright, and carrying no warmth whatsoever in the light it delivered, all illumination and no heat. She went back underground and made breakfast. By mid-morning, she could hear sounds above that were not storm sounds. People moving, the rhythmic scrape of shovels, voices carrying across the cold air, the words indistinct, but the tone recognizable as the tone of people assessing damage and beginning the work of recovery. Earl Moss came before noon. He came on foot from the east, wading through the drifts with the slow and deliberate movement of a 71-year-old man who has somewhere specific to go and is going there regardless of what the terrain is doing. He was dressed in everything he owned, and he moved with the compressed purposefulness of someone who has been thinking about something through a long night and has decided to find out if what he was thinking is accurate. He stopped when he reached Edna's woodpile. He stood there for a long moment looking at it. The pile was almost exactly as it had been before the storm. A cord and a half, maybe slightly less, against the barn wall. The canvas cover had been compressed by snow, but the pile beneath it was intact and largely untouched. Edna was in the barn when he came to the door, forking hay to the animals. She looked at him across the space. "My family burned through 3 weeks of supply in 3 days," he said. "We burned the grain sled." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small brass thermometer, the kind he carried habitually for checking livestock conditions. He held it up. "I would like to see it," he said, "if you are willing." She led him to the trap door and opened it. The warm air rose. He looked down the ladder for a moment, then climbed down. Edna followed. He stood at the foot of the ladder and looked around the room and said nothing. He had the slightly dazed expression of a man whose expectations have been systematically contradicted by what he is currently experiencing. He walked to the south wall and put his hand against the limestone. He walked to the east wall and put his hand against that one too. Dry, solid, warm in the way that a stone that has been absorbing heat for months is warm, not hot, Not the aggressive heat of a fire, but the steady, even warmth of mass that has been patiently doing its job. He pulled the thermometer from his coat pocket and held it level in the center of the room and watched the mercury. It stopped at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked at it for a long time. He turned it slightly in the lamplight to read the marking as if the number might be different from a different angle. It was not different. The stove has been out since yesterday evening, Edna said. Moss turned the thermometer over in his fingers the way a person handles an object when their hands need to do something while their mind processes. He walked the full perimeter of the room, touching each wall, looking up at the ceiling, beams finding the ventilation shaft in its disguised post and following it upward with his eyes. When he had completed the circuit, he stood in the center of the room and looked at the thermometer one more time. 58 degrees, 14 hours without fire. How much wood, he said. 6 to 10 logs per day, Edna said. During the storm, 10. The coldest nights, 12. He looked at her. We burned 40 logs a day, he said. The cabin did not go above 40 degrees. The arithmetic sat between them like an object that had been placed on a table and could not be ignored. 40 logs a day and 38 degrees. 10 logs a day and 58 degrees. The gap between those two sets of numbers was not a small gap that could be explained by variation or luck or the particular character of a given season. It was a structural gap. It was the gap between a method that was fighting the wrong battle and a method that had identified the right one. Earl Moss had been in Montana for over 30 years. He had survived those 30 years by being the kind of man who looked at evidence and revised his conclusions when the evidence required it. He was looking at the evidence now. Mrs. Marsh, he said with a quietness that had nothing of condescension in it, I thought this was foolishness. Most people did, Edna said. I should have asked why your girls looked better than everyone else's last winter, why your wood piles seemed to last longer. He paused. I decided you were wrong before I looked at whether you were right. Edna looked at the thermometer in his hand. I was not right or wrong, she said. I was cold and my daughters were cold, and this made us less cold. That is all it ever was. Moss was quiet for a moment, then he looked up at the trapdoor above them. Would you allow me to bring some people by to see this, he said. Bring whoever wants to see it, Edna said. I am not hiding anything. He climbed the ladder and emerged into the coal barn. She followed. At the top, he stood for a moment looking back at the trapdoor flush with the floor invisible now that the feed sacks were back in place. He tucked the thermometer into his coat. He left. By the end of the first week after the storm, 7 families had come. By the end of the second, 11. They came in ones and twos at different times of day in the cold and careful manner of people who have been through something significant and are still processing what it cost them. Some came with the studied casualness of people pretending their interest is general rather than personal. Some came directly and without pretense the way people come when pride has been stripped away by something larger than pride. All of them climbed down the ladder and stood in the underground room and felt what they felt. Edna let the room do the speaking. She stood by the stove and answered questions when questions were asked, and she watched their faces go through the process that faces go through when a person is revising something they thought they understood. Not dramatic revision, the quiet, private kind, the kind that happens when evidence is present and undeniable and cannot be argued with. Frank Connell asked about the ventilation system first. He was the practical one of the 2 Connell brothers, the one who built things and thought carefully about how things were built and what could go wrong with them. He followed the stovepipe with his eyes, found the ventilation shaft, turned to Edna. She explained the 3 pathways, the differential pressure logic, the carbon monoxide risk she had calculated and built against. Frank nodded slowly, the nod of a man whose objections are being answered in sequence before he has raised them. Amaue Moose Connell asked about the load-bearing structure. The ceiling. What happened if the barn floor shifted under seasonal load? Edna pointed to the beams. She explained the notching, the bedrock anchoring, the distinction between load-bearing into rock versus load-bearing into earth. Jonas Whitfield said nothing at all. He stood in the center of the room with his bandaged hand held against his chest, 2 fingers gone to frostbite on the second night of the blizzard, when cold air had found its way through a wall gap despite everything he had done to prevent it. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the thermometer for a long time. Then he looked at Edna. My youngest lost those fingers inside the cabin, he said. Mo outside, inside, 3 feet from the fire. Edna said nothing. There was nothing to say that the thermometer had not already said with greater precision than words could manage. Eliza Connell, who came on the 9th day with her husband Frank, sat on the bench beside the table and looked at Ida doing her schoolwork and said, "She looks well." "She is," Edna said. "She was coughing all of last winter." Yes, Eliza looked at the ceiling, at the warmth that required no particular effort or drama to exist. "We burned the kitchen bench during the storm," she said. "Our youngest cried about it." She paused. "Mo about the cold, about the bench. Her grandmother built it." Edna poured tea and handed the cup across and said nothing about furniture or grandmothers or what the storm had taken from people. She just let the warmth of the room be what it was, which was what it had been every night since November, which was enough. Silas Pratt came back on January 24th. He had been at the property 10 miles south until the roads permitted travel, managing the cracked chimney repair in the intervals when the temperature rose enough for the clay to work. He had heard about the wood pile from Jonas Whitfield, who had described it at the settlement store with the careful precision of a man who wanted the facts represented exactly as they were. Pratt arrived alone in the mid-morning. He came to the barn door and knocked once. Edna was inside with the animals. He said, "I heard about the numbers." "Yes," she said. "I would like to see it again. Properly this time." She led him to the trapdoor. He went down alone, which she had not expected. She stayed in the barn above and listened to him move through the space below. Deliberate footsteps, a long pause at the east wall near the stovepipe fitting, a longer pause at the ceiling where she could hear his hands moving along the beam joints, a pause at the ventilation shaft. The sound of him completing the full perimeter, touching each wall in turn. He was down there for a long time. When he came back up, he stood in the barn with his tools over his shoulder and looked at a point somewhere between Edna and the middle of the space and was quiet. Then, "The notching on those beams is correct. Better than correct. The load path goes directly to bedrock. There is no drift load on the earth fill." "No," Edna said. "The ventilation is more sophisticated than I understood when I first looked at it. 3 pathways, different angles, different pressure profiles. If 2 of them clog simultaneously in a hard freeze, the third stays open on differential pressure." He paused. "I did not see that the first time." "You were not looking for it the first time," Edna said. "You were looking for the failure." He absorbed this. He looked at the barn floor where the trapdoors sat flush and invisible. "I told you I had seen men with engineering training try things like this," he said. "That was true, but I did not tell you the rest of it." Edna waited. He set his tools down against the barn wall. He looked at her directly with the directness of a man who has decided on honesty and is going to deliver it without management. "Wyoming," he said. 1879. I built something similar for my brother's family, smaller than this. I used timber walls because stone was scarce, and I told myself the insulation properties were close enough. They were not. Moisture got into the wood over 2 months. The timber began holding carbon monoxide instead of venting it. My brother's wife woke unable to move her legs. Their daughter did not wake at all initially. Both recovered. It took 3 weeks. Edna said nothing. I walked away from that design and told myself I would never recommend anything like it again. When I saw what you were building, I saw my mistake in it and assumed it was your mistake too. I told you it was dangerous because I needed it to be dangerous. Because if it was not, then mine had simply been wrong. Not wrong in principle, wrong in execution. I had not been wrong because the idea was flawed. I had been wrong because I built it badly." He looked at the trap door. "You built it right. Stone instead of timber. 3 ventilation pathways instead of 1. Load to bedrock rather than earth. You solved the problems I created." Edna looked at him. "Thomas had a sketch," she said, "in a notebook. He had seen the same idea and started working on it before he died. I followed what he started." She paused. "And I thought about everything that could go wrong, and I built against each of those things one at a time." Pratt nodded, the slow nod of a man who recognizes a methodology he respects whatever its source. "I am doing a project in Helena," he said, "a boarding house. The owner wants winter sleeping quarters that do not require constant fire tending. I have been thinking about the approach since before the storm." He picked up his tools. I would like to use this design as the basis, if you would permit it. Edna looked at him for a moment. She thought about the 6 words he had said to the people assembled outside after this his second inspection, the thorough one. Earl Moss had told her about it, 6 words delivered to the gathered crowd without elaboration and without excuse. I was wrong. She was right. The way an honest man delivers a verdict, he has earned by looking at the evidence carefully and accepting what it shows. It is not mine to keep, she said. Use it if it helps people. Pratt reached into his coat and produced a small working notebook and a pencil stub, the tools of a tradesman's pocket, and asked if she would walk him through the measurements, the beam dimensions, the stone courses, the ventilation angles, and the physics behind each one. They spent an hour in the barn, Edna talking and Pratt writing in his careful tradesman's hand. She gave him everything: the depth to bedrock, the dimensions, the limestone source and the quarrying method, the beam specifications and the salvage locations, the stovepipe routing, the 3 ventilation pathways with their angles and their pressure relationships, and the carbon monoxide calculus behind each design decision. She gave it all with the tone. She gave everything, which was the tone of someone reporting facts. Not performing generosity, just giving what she had because holding it served no purpose. When they were done, Pratt closed the notebook. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite gratitude, but something that lived in the territory between them, the expression an older man carries when he has been wrong in a costly way and chooses to be honest about it rather than managing the acknowledgement. The engineering is sound, he said. Anyone who looks at it carefully will see that. It kept my daughters warm, Edna said. That is the only engineering assessment that mattered. He left. She watched him ride north toward Helena and stood in the cold barn doorway for a moment and thought about Thomas's notebook on the shelf above the fireplace in the empty cabin and the sketch with its penciled arrows and the 2 words at the bottom of the page. Worth investigating. They had been. Spring came late to the valley in 1888. April arrived cold, the ground still locked under the last of the season's frost, the cottonwoods bare and reluctant along the creek. But by mid-month, the light had changed to the particular quality of Montana's spring light, which arrives not as warmth but as duration, the days lengthening and pressing back against the cold by sheer weight of accumulated hours, and by the last week of April, the ground had softened enough that a spade could work it without ringing. 3 families began digging in May. The Connell brothers, Amos and Frank, built beneath their shared storage building on the property line between their adjoining claims. Smaller than Edna's 8 by 8 feet, but built on the same principles because Frank Connell had listened carefully and written nothing down because he did not need to, the logic being sufficient. Stone walls hauled from the same creek bed, 8-inch timbers notched to bedrock, a small stove sized to the space, 3 ventilation pathways at 3 different angles. They moved their 4 youngest children's beds down in October of 1888. That winter, none of the 4 children developed the deep chest cough that had attended every previous autumn. Frank Connell sent Edna a note in November. 1 sentence, children are well. She read it twice and set it on the shelf beside Thomas's notebook. The Whitfield family, Jonas and his wife Harriet, dug beneath their hay barn that same spring. Jonas had 3/4 of his left hand now, which made the heavy work slow, but he had 2 grown sons, and they dug through May and into June with the determination of men who had watched frostbite take part of their father in a cabin that was supposed to protect him. They went deeper than Edna had, 10 feet rather than 8, and lined the walls with sandstone from the ridge to the east rather than limestone from the creek. The sandstone held heat measurably longer than limestone, not dramatically longer. But Jonas measured it with the same small brass thermometer he had held in Edna's underground room in January, and the numbers were clear. 16 hours at 60 degrees after the stove went cold in the depths of the following December. They also partitioned off a section of the underground room for root vegetable storage, a wooden divider separating the sleeping space from the storage, and found that the stable temperature solved the freeze and thaw problem that had been destroying their potato stores for years. The design had solved 2 problems simultaneously, neither of which had been the original intention when the spade went into the ground. By the winter of 1889, 5 homesteads in the valley had some version of underground winter quarters. By 1891-14, the designs varied in their particulars, some under barns, some beneath storage buildings. Some expanded from existing root cellars through additional excavation. One, the most ambitious, built with a masonry core rather than a cast iron stove, the mass of the masonry absorbing and releasing heat over a longer cycle than the iron could manage. But the core principles remained constant across all of them because the core principles were not design choices. They were physics: thermal mass in the walls, earth insulation on three sides, passive heat from above where livestock were available, a small stove sized to the space rather than to an ambition, ventilation built for safety first and convenience second. The diffusion happened the way useful things diffuse in practical communities, which is without fanfare and without evangelism and without anyone claiming credit for anything. People saw something that worked better than what they were doing, and they did it. They improved on it when they found improvements. They adapted it to their available materials. They passed the information between themselves in the ordinary course of conversation without ceremony. Margaret Hollis built her underground room in the fall of 1889. She hired two men from the next valley to do the digging and the stonework men who had not been in the valley in January of 1888 and who asked no questions about the origins of the design. She supervised everything herself, which was how she supervised everything she cared about, with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the difference between a thing working and a thing failing was usually in the details. She called it a winter storage room. When neighbors asked, she said she had been thinking about reducing root vegetable losses to the freeze-thaw cycle. This was accurate. The room served that purpose well. She did not mention Edna. Edna did not expect her to and did not require it. She heard about Margaret's excavation from Eliza Connell, who mentioned it as information rather than commentary, the way useful information passes through a community that has learned to treat it as a resource rather than a weapon. Edna heard it and said nothing and went back to the morning's work. She thought briefly about what it meant. A woman who had called her undignified or was now sleeping in a room built on the same principles for the same reasons. She thought about it the way she thought about weather. It was what it was. It had happened. It changed nothing about the temperature underground or the sound of Ida's breathing or the size of the woodpile in March. What it changed was that Margaret Hollis's family was going to be warmer. That was what had always been the point. The territorial newspaper ran a story in February of 1888 under the headline, "Widow's Winter Quarters Prove Warmer Than Convention." The reporter had assembled the piece from accounts at the settlement store rather than from a visit to the property, which meant the dimensions were wrong, and the stone type was wrong, and the depth was wrong, and the description of the ventilation system suggested he had not fully understood what he was describing. But the core was right. Underground, stone walls, animal heat above, minimal fuel. The idea reached people who were already thinking about next winter, and that was enough. Edna's name appeared once in the first paragraph as Mrs. E. Marsh of the 16-Mile Creek area and did not appear again. The pamphlet came in 1893. The Territorial Agricultural Extension Office published a small document titled Earth-Sheltered Winter Quarters, Observations from Montana Homesteads. 8 pages, rough diagrams, materials lists, construction notes drawn from several examples across the territory, and a 2-paragraph case study about a widowed homesteader near 16-Mile Creek who had reduced her winter fuel consumption by 70% while maintaining sleeping temperatures 18 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit higher than conventional cabins in the same valley. The case study did not include a name. Lavinia found the pamphlet at the settlement store in late November and brought it home and set it on the table at dinner and pointed to the 2 paragraphs and looked at her mother. Lavinia was 21 years old by then. Her father's precision in her face and her mother's steadiness in the way she held herself and the edge in her voice when she spoke was the edge of a young woman who has watched someone work and watched the work get attributed to the general air. "They did not put your name," she said. Edna picked up the pamphlet. She read the 2 paragraphs carefully. The numbers were right. The principles were described correctly. Whoever had compiled the information had understood what they were describing, which was more than the newspaper reporter in 1888 had managed. She set the pamphlet down. "Widowed homesteader near 16-Mile Creek," she said. "That is accurate." "They should have named you," Lavinia said. Edna looked at her daughter for a moment. She thought about the families in 14 homesteads sleeping warmly. She thought about the letter from Silas Pratt in the winter of 1889, describing the Helena boarding house with its 6 underground sleeping rooms, each one maintaining 60 degrees with minimal fuel guests, arriving expecting to shiver through Montana nights. She thought about Ida asleep now, in the room below them, 15 years old, healthy, her lungs clear, planning her future with the confidence of someone who has never been seriously ill, which was what she was, which was what she had been for 6 years now. Does Ida cough at night? Edna said. Lavinia paused. No. Did she last winter? No. The winter before that? No. Lavinia's voice had quieted. Then that, Edna said, is my name in the pamphlet. That is where I put it. She slid the document across the table. Keep it if you want, she said. It is a good document. Lavinia held it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat close to her chest, which was not where you put something you intend to discard. By 1891, the design had traveled beyond the immediate valley through the pamphlet, through Silas Pratt's Helena project, and through the ordinary movement of people who had seen something work and carried the knowledge with them when they moved. 3 homesteads in the Judith Basin, 2 more near the Missouri headwaters. A ranch in the Gallatin Valley whose owner had wintered in the original valley spent 2 years thinking about what he had seen in the underground room and then acted on it. The term barn quarters had entered local vocabulary by 1890 without irony. What had been called undignified in 1887 was practical by 1889 and simply sensible by 1891. The social layer dropped away the way social layers always drop away when the practical question becomes urgent enough. Nobody called it strange when it kept their children from coughing. Nobody called it beneath dignity when it cut their wood consumption by 3/4, and the savings in fuel and in suffering were visible in March in the size of the woodpile and the color in the children's faces. Silas Pratt wrote to Edna in December of 1891 from Helena. The letter was brief in the manner of a man who has learned to be brief because brevity respects the recipient's time. He said the boarding house design had been replicated by 2 other builders in the territory. He said the pamphlet had reached the Dakotas based on a letter he had received from a homesteader in Bismarck. He said he had done the arithmetic on the aggregate and estimated that the design in all its variations across the territory was saving somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 cords of wood per winter. He gave the number without editorializing because the number was sufficient on its own. She wrote back a single line, "Tell me how the boarding house held through January." His reply came in February. 61 degrees, coldest night of the season, 8 logs per room. She put the letter with Thomas's notebook and Frank Connell's note and the folded pamphlet that Lavinia had left on the shelf the following morning. Pastor Nolan left the valley in the spring of 1890. His health had been declining since the winter of 1888, something in his lungs that the cold made worse each season, and his sister in Denver had been asking him to come since 1889. He moved south in April when the pass roads opened. Before he left, he came to the homestead. He stood in the barn with less of whatever had been sitting on his shoulders during his earlier visits, the formal concern that had served as the outer garment of something more complicated. He asked if he could go down one more time. She led him to the trapdoor. He climbed down alone and stayed for a while. When he came back up and they stood at the barn door in the mild spring air, he said, "I should have come down the first time you asked." "It would not have changed anything," Edna said. "It would have changed what I thought." "Perhaps," she said, "but what you thought did not affect whether it worked." He looked at her for a moment. He was a man who took some trouble to be honest when honesty was the correct response, even when it was not comfortable. "No," he said, "I suppose it did not." He left for Denver that April. Edna did not hear from him again. Lavinia married in 1892 a rancher named Aldous Beckett from the next valley, who had the quality that Edna had learned to value above most others in a person, which was that he paid attention to evidence and revised his conclusions accordingly. He was also patient and good-humored and made Lavinia laugh, which Edna considered a reasonable set of qualifications for a life together. They built their homestead 3 miles east, and in the fall of 1892, without being asked, without discussion, Aldous Beckett dug an underground room beneath their barn. He had grown up hearing about it. Ida went to Helena in the fall of 1896. She was 18 years old and her lungs had been clear for 9 winters. And she was ready in the way that people are ready for the next thing when the previous thing has been as complete and good as it can be. She completed her teacher's training in 2 years and accepted a position at a school on the east side of the city where she taught reading and arithmetic and the principles of practical reasoning to children who had not yet had to apply those principles to anything that cost much. She wrote to Edna every 2 weeks. The letters were long and detailed and had a particular kind of dry humor in them that was Thomas's, which Ida had inherited the way children inherit things from parents they barely knew through some channel that has nothing to do with memory. In the winter of 1897, she wrote, "My students think I grew up in a house. I told them I grew up under a barn. They did not believe me. I explained the physics. They still did not believe me. Then I drew them the diagram, and they got very quiet, and I think at least 2 of them went home and told their fathers." Edna read this letter sitting at the table in the cabin, which she still used during the days in winter, though she had been sleeping underground every winter since 1887. It was November and the cabin was cold in the familiar way, the frost on the north wall and the fire working against the structural disadvantage it had been working against for 23 years. But it was a cold she had options against now, and having options changes the nature of cold considerably. She folded the letter and put it on the shelf. She thought about Thomas as she thought about him most evenings in the later years, not with the acute grief of the early years after 1884, but with something more like the ongoing conversation you have with someone who has been gone long enough that the grief has become part of the furniture of your life, present and acknowledged, but no longer in the foreground. She thought about the sketch and the 2 words in the cedar chest where the notebook had waited. She thought about the morning in the barn with the milk pail, the cold at her back, and the modest warmth of the animals, and the thought so simple it had almost embarrassed her. The animals sleep warmer than my children. She thought about Ida's letter in her hand, the daughter with clear lungs teaching other children in a warm schoolroom in Helena, and about Lavinia 3 miles east with her patient, attentive husband in the underground room beneath their barn that Aldous had dug without being asked because he understood the value of what he had inherited by proximity. She thought about the room below her feet, which had been doing its quiet and reliable work every winter since 1887, without drama and without failure, and without requiring anything from her except the 10 logs a day that kept the stone walls charged with heat. And she thought about Thomas's 2 words on the shelf above her in his leather notebook. Worth investigating. She had investigated. The investigation had led her 8 feet into the Montana earth and into the bedrock beneath it, and into 20 winters of sleeping warmly while the world above did its worst, and into letters from the Dakotas about pamphlets, and into the sound of Ida's breathing clear and steady for 9 consecutive winters. She had not proven anything to anyone. She had not set out to prove anything. She had simply been cold, and her daughters had been cold, and she had followed the heat to where it went, and built herself a place to be where it collected, and that was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it. Edna Marsh died in March of 1904, influenza, which that winter moved through the older residents of the valley with particular efficiency, the way serious illness moves through people whose bodies have been doing the sustained and costly work of survival for a long time. She was 80 years old. She had been 63 in the winter of 1887, when she had dug the first hole in the ground beneath the northwest corner of her barn. She had spent 17 winters in the room since the blizzard that had been the hardest test, and she had spent all of them warm, and Ida had never coughed again after the first winter underground, and the room had never failed. Her obituary in the territorial paper was brief. It mentioned her homestead and her years in the valley. It mentioned her daughters, one of them a teacher in Helena, one of them the wife of a rancher in the next valley. It said she was remembered as a woman of quiet competence and practical wisdom. It did not mention the underground room. By 1904, the room was not remarkable. It had not been remarkable for years. It had been practical by 1889 and sensible by 1891, and by 1904, it was simply one of the ways that people who had been in the territory long enough sometimes dealt with Montana winters. The technique had been in the pamphlet since 1893. The boarding houses in Helena had been running on the same principles for 15 years. The terminology had settled into the local vocabulary without irony or explanation. The room continued. The homestead changed hands twice in the years after Edna's death. The barn was rebuilt in 1923 when the old structure had reached the end of what it had to give, the original timbers finally succumbing to 40 years of freeze and thaw. The builders found the stone-lined room during the excavation for the new footings and worked around it rather than through it because the limestone was solid and the bedrock anchoring was clearly sound, and there was no practical reason to demolish something built that well. New owners used it for storage, potatoes mostly, canned goods, the occasional crock of preserved fruit that needed a stable temperature through the winter months. It kept everything above freezing and below spoiling with the same indifferent reliability it had always offered. The temperature held in its usual range, the mid-50s, without any assistance, because the earth on three sides was doing what the earth at that depth always did, which was hold steady while the world above it went through its seasons. The ventilation shaft still worked. It had always worked. There was no reason it would not continue to work. The beam joints that Silas Pratt had inspected in January of 1888 and declared sound were still sound in 1923. They were still sound in 1950. They were still sound in the years beyond that because they had been notched into bedrock by someone who understood that bedrock does not move and had built accordingly, and bedrock had continued to oblige by not moving. In the 1970s, a historical society surveyor working on documentation of frontier-era homesteads in the county came across the room during a property assessment. She was a careful and thorough woman, the kind who does not file incomplete reports, and she spent 2 hours in the room with her measuring tape and her notebook. She found the limestone walls hand-split and fitted with a degree of care and precision that suggested someone had taken considerable trouble over them. She found the ventilation shaft still open to the barn above, still functional, still moving air through the differential pressure pathways that had been designed to keep it working even if the primary route failed. She found the blackened mark on the stone floor where a small cast iron stove had stood for however many years. It had stood there, the mark permanent in the stone, the way the record of heat is permanent in certain materials. She noted in her report an unusual but effectively designed below-grade living space consistent with documented earth-sheltered construction techniques of the late 19th century. She noted the quality of the stonework, which she described as exceeding what was typical for utilitarian frontier construction. She noted the ventilation design, which she described as sophisticated for its era and for the presumed training level of whoever had built it. She noted that the space maintained a stable temperature of 56 degrees Fahrenheit on the day of her inspection. The day of her inspection was in January. The outdoor temperature was -17. She did not know whose hands had split the limestone. She did not know about Thomas's notebook or the sketch with its penciled arrows pointing upward through the barn floor. She did not know about the February morning in the milk pail and the simple thought that had started it. She did not know about Ida's cough, or the night Margaret Hollis had walked half a mile through -34 air, or the sound of a thermometer being read in a coal barn by a 71-year-old man who had just watched his woodpile tell him something he had not wanted to know. She filed her report and moved on to the next property on her list. The room continued. It does not need to be known about to do what it does. It does not need a historical marker or a glass case or a paragraph in a book. It does not need the surveyor's report or the territorial pamphlet or the boarding house in Helena or any of the things that touched its edges without quite capturing it. It was built for a specific and practical purpose, and it has been serving that purpose for 137 years without interruption, and the interruption is not coming. That is the nature of something built correctly. It keeps working after the person who built it is gone. It keeps working after the reason it was built has been forgotten. It keeps working in the cold and the dark and the indifferent passage of seasons, doing what it was made to do, asking nothing, requiring nothing, maintaining 56 degrees in January, while the world above it swings through its extremes and the frost comes and goes, and the snow falls and melts and falls again. Edna Marsh understood something about heat. She understood that it moves upward and that the places above rising heat are cold and the places below it are warm. She understood that stone holds what air releases. She understood that the earth beneath your feet is more stable than the sky above your head, that the ground at 8 feet does not care what the temperature is at 8 inches. That bedrock does not negotiate with seasons. She understood these things not because she was trained or credentialed or considered an authority on anything by anyone in her community. She understood them because she was cold, and her daughters were cold, and the conventional methods were failing, and she was the kind of person who looks at a problem from every available angle until she finds one that does not come back with the same wrong answer. She was 63 years old. She had no engineering training, no formal education beyond what the country schools of her youth had provided. No husband to consult, no partner to share the risk, no one to tell her the idea was sound before she put the first spade in the ground at 4 in the morning, in the dark and cold of a March day, when the frost was barely out of the top 8 inches and the rest of the valley was still asleep. She dug down, 8 feet into the Montana earth, into the bedrock, into the stable and unhurried temperature that the frost never reaches, and she built her walls from limestone that had been sitting in the creek bed since before anyone in the valley was born. And she set her ceiling beams into the rock, and she connected her small stove to the air above, and she climbed down the ladder with her daughters and pulled the trapdoor closed and lit a fire and waited. And the room warmed, and it held, and it kept holding. Outside on a January night in 2024, the thermometer on the fence post at the Old Marsh property reads -22 Fahrenheit. The wind moves across the valley the way it has always moved, looking for gaps to work through, finding them in structures that were not built to resist it and not finding them in the earth itself, which has no gaps, which is its nature and its strength. Below the barn floor in the stone room where limestone walls were fitted by hand, in the spring of 1887, a brass thermometer hangs on a nail. No fire, no stove, no living woman tending coals at midnight, counting the logs against the weeks remaining, until March. The mercury rests at 56 degrees, just the earth doing what the earth has always done. Holding steady, holding what it was given, giving it back slowly in the dark. Exactly as Edna Marsh observed it would on a February morning 137 years ago, when she stood in a cold barn with a milk pail in her hand and looked at the floor beneath her feet and began to understand where the warmth was going and what it meant to build yourself a place where it collected. She was not a genius. She was not trained. She was not in any way that the valley recognized at the time an authority on anything. She was cold, and her children were cold, and she went looking for the warmth, and she found it.